On this episode of A State of Control, we talk about the importance of firmware. What do you need to consider? How do you manage it? And whose responsibility is it in the end? All that and more on A State of Control.
The network for the AV industry.
What are you listening to?
This
is AV.
This
is AVNation.
This is AVNation.
A State of Control.
A State of Control, episode 42, RAG, Red, Amber, Green.
Support for AVNation is brought to you by BiAmp.
Welcome to A State of Control, an AVNation podcast that focuses on the control programming and automation aspects of the audiovisual industry. My name is Steve Greenblatt. I'm your host. Thank you very much for joining us. Today we have a show plan that I think is going to strike a nerve with certain people, but I think it's important for us to discuss whether it's something that is being currently wrestled with or is going to be something that the audience and programmers and integrators and technology managers are going to all encounter, and manufacturers actually. It's the importance of managing firmware and its impact on control systems. So with me to discuss this topic, I'll first start by introducing my partner in crime. His name is Rich Fergoza from Fergoza Design, also known as Uncle Richie. How are you today?
Good. Happy 2018 from rainy California, but obviously we're not frozen like I know you guys are on your side of the country.
Yeah, it's supposed to break soon, but we've been reminded of the cold, that's for sure. Next, I'd like to introduce Michael Brathwaite. He's been a regular on AV Week and new to this show. How are you today, Mike?
I'm doing great, and I wish you and everybody else a very prosperous 2018.
Thank you. You too. And last but not least, his name is Mark Peterson. He's from Shen Milson Milwaukee. How are you today, Mark? Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. Hi, Richard, Michael. Looking forward to talking to you today.
Thank you. So for many years, firmware has been something that's been discussed in relation to control systems. And it's also been this type of situation where you didn't really touch firmware unless you had to, whether you were doing something to fix an issue or unveil a new feature. But if you got a good version of firmware, you kind of stuck with it. These days, though, with more devices being programmable and software-based, firmware is really something that needs to be considered and has a lot of moving parts. And when you change firmware on one device, the impact that it has on other devices could be unpredictable and really needs to be looked at. So, Rich, let's start it off with you. You and I have been down this road, and we've been doing this for a while from a control system standpoint. When it comes to firmware, how do you actually figure out how to go about upgrading firmware and also trying to figure out too now that firmware is something that is a little bit more accessible to our clients and even users. So it really kind of opens up a can of worms. As from a programmer's perspective, how do you go about approaching it?
Well, I think the biggest thing is more or less changing our approach and our definition of firmware. I think when we first started, we had processors which were purpose-driven processors. I mean, they had only so much programmable memory. They had very specific purposes, and we were running very specific code on those. And so when we were connected to devices, we were still using the traditional forms of control: serial control RS-232, IR, relay, and voltage. The conversation has to change at this point in that we're not dealing with firmware anymore. We're dealing with software updates. So the same way when you pick up your handheld device or you show up at your computer or your laptop or something, you see the little indicator that's like software update available. That's what we're dealing with at this point. In that it's not necessarily our units that we have to focus with firmware updates. It's the fact that everything around us is constantly in flux. And we're seeing it obviously on the residential side and the commercial side and ed and government. And the reason being is that it comes back to security. And it's about the conversation we need to start having, which is, it's not that we're increasing performance or we're adding a new feature or a widget. It's that we're having to constantly be mindful of keeping these systems secure and reliable, and not due to our system, but due to the other systems that are out there, and making sure that we're not a point of exploit. So it's required us personally to take a look and say, hey, it's like you said, in the intro, in the old days, we found a version that worked and we just left it and we were good to go, and you never touch it again. When we were controlling the sandbox and the ecosystem, kind of centered around us, that was a lot easier to do. But the problem is now we're a component of a much larger IT ecosystem. And so we have to keep pace with the changes that are occurring with the other devices, instead of leading out front. And so it's been interesting, because you have to have that conversation with your clients as well. And nobody really likes talking about vulnerability with their system before they've even put it in.
So, Michael, from a manufacturer's standpoint, I know that you've worn many different hats, both looking at it from a control side and also looking at it from a third party. The matching firmware together, it becomes a challenge, and is it a responsibility of the manufacturer to ensure that their firmware is going to match up with these devices, or is it the integrator's responsibility to kind of bring everything together?
Well, it's a great question, and from the manufacturer's point of view, it's a big responsibility, and many of the manufacturers take that very seriously. They go through extensive training as they're doing their firmware updates. But one thing that has complicated, even from the manufacturing side, much as Rich alluded to in his comments, was we were used to dealing with embedded devices, which had a very limited OS, so to speak, that was running on it, and everything was done by the developer. A lot of the products today are based on some other OS or other platform. So if it's on a Windows platform, for example, let's say the product is based and it's running an embedded Windows, there's additional OS and other firmware. So you may have a Crestron firmware, and you may have a Microsoft firmware update, which might be a security issue. The main reason that manufacturers update firmware is fixing bugs. So we're constantly squashing bugs, we're constantly fixing and making improvements. And so your question directly was talking about, if you had one device, if I had one control processor, and whether I change the firmware on that one processor, that's one thing. And a lot of companies have their own internal policies, much as what was mentioned about, once we have a firmware that we feel comfortable with, we may stay on that firmware, even if there's a newly introduced manufacturer firmware. However, there's a big difference between a control processor firmware, which is typically going into one device, and a distributed AV over IP system where I might have 50 encoders and 80 decoders. So now you're talking about 130 devices. Some of the bugs that get fixed in that firmware may directly tie into synchronization, the way the devices communicate to each other, and so forth. And so from a manufacturing point of view, again, once you're outside of one box, then the firmware uniform across the platform, because that might be through a whole building, right? That you're going to have devices all throughout that facility. And so, and of course, in those kind of cases, you're going across a network. So there's also, we could even talk about network like switch firmware, router firmware. So you see, it's not where it used to be one firmware that we all worried about, and it was that one thing. Now you're talking about, boy, you should have proper documentation of all of the firmware. And again, on the multimedia and on the streaming part, without having a uniform firmware across them, you can lose out on some improvements against like synchronization, frame locking, things like that, like on a video wall. A video wall is probably one of the more important ones, where you might have 9 decoders on a 3x3 video wall. All of those need the exact same firmware of every kind.
So Mark, I'll kind of jump over to you, and you're currently in the role of a consultant, an audiovisual consultant, but you've also worn the hat of a technology manager at a larger firm. I know that you and I have talked a lot about the idea of coming up with a way to manage firmware. And, as Mike alluded to, and as Rich alluded to, this is in no way, shape, or form limited to even the AV space. How did you go about handling that? And do you feel like this is something that should be driven by one party in particular?
Yeah, I think the end user, in most cases, I think we have to, I was going to ask the question at the start of how do we define firmware. I think both of the guests have already kind of spoken to that in one way or another, that it is larger than just a definition of firmware. And I think we also have clients that either have an inside, a fairly extensive inside operational model, or they're dependent upon third parties outside to do that support for them. So there's certainly a big difference, particularly as you scale up and you're trying to manage a lot of rooms. And as Mike was talking about, the interdependencies are quite steep. So what I initially encountered, and I share with my clients, is a process by what we're seeing, this concept of becoming more IT-centric. With that should come processes that are also IT-centric. So where previously a company would roll out a firmware, Crestron software update, and they'd kind of go about doing it, and if they had they may do it completely independent of any other activities or downtimes that are occurring within the firm. Meanwhile, as these companies start taking the multimedia side into the IT departments, the deployment and change management becomes critical, because they're putting these out at the same time that other software releases are happening. So you have a change management process, right? And so that means that your rollouts shouldn't be happening in the middle of the week. They're going to be strategic. They're going to be at the end of the week, and there's a process. So let me take you through a couple of things that I've learned, and I think the biggest one was a tracking mechanism Mike was talking about. And we use the term in the IT group, and I'm not in IT from a long history, so this is sort of where I felt comfortable. Something called the RAG status report, which is red, amber, and green, right? So, okay, I'm going to be providing a report and looking at the risks, but more to our area, it's a version of maybe a preliminary version of software, the actual running, previous version of software, the actual running version, and maybe several beta versions that you have coming up. But that's just one tab on a workbook that includes every single different product that has some sort of version of software that could touch your system. So there may be a tracking mechanism on all your Cisco video conferencing units. There may be one on your Clear One mixing system, and so each one of those has to be looked at. And so when you do an update, as you mentioned before, it's not the most recent one, and it has to be working across all of the various versions. So we track that way, but what's fixed in this version, what is also an enhancement or future enhancement in each version. We'll also do a process in which we are vetting small portions of code out at a time and then rolling it up into a release. Because now you can, if you start to do that and segregate out, you have a little bit better chance that each component's going to work the way you expect it. And then in our deployment model, where not only do we have lab spaces that are identical to the environment, right? Which is really a problem for a lot of clients, is creating an exact replica of the environment. It's not your, skunk works. It's a real working space. It's exactly what's in the environment. And that can't replicate all the variables. So you have to now look at, how do I take what I'm able to validate in my lab and roll it out into the space? And typically that means you've got some prototype spaces or some early adopters that are willing to take risk, and then you move from region to region. So this process here is all about mitigating the risk. Where it starts to become a problem is when, and we saw this last year, I think quite a bit in the year before, is when like OpenSSL and issues that are security based start coming out. And all of a sudden your prioritization is to close the security gap. So all the more reason why you have to have a really detailed tracking mechanism, so you can see, well, what version am I on? When am I going to get to that security release? So I got to tell the people in the IT department. So keeping this huge ball rolling, using the IT methodologies that your peers are using in the group, were very important, as well as the rollback process. Well, how am I going to implement it? What am I going to do if it doesn't work? What's the contingency process? What's my window? And who do I tell everybody when it's all back? These are things that a couple of years ago, no one was doing this way to make that much of a difference. And now they're all tied together.
I would wholeheartedly agree, and thank you. That was a very, very nicely put approach. Rich, I'll kind of jump over to you, and I've kind of two things I think that we need to touch on. One is the idea that we have these devices, say it's an iPad, which is being commonly used, and Mike was saying, what happens when you have the other operating systems that come into play that you really can't control. But more importantly, when something changes in a system and all of a sudden it stops working, how does a programmer go about managing this? Because unfortunately, as you know, when you press a button and it doesn't work, you call the programmer.
We've dealt with this quite a bit, especially in the past few years. And a perfect example is, tablets and handheld devices. There were a couple of instances where Apple made a change to their operating system where they finally moved it over to a 64-bit architecture, and they weren't supporting 32-bit architecture in their apps. So all of a sudden, apps that have been working for years, literally, stopped working. Not because there was any change in the tools that we provided, but it was an outside environment. And so what we're having to do now at this point is you're having to have that conversation, and more importantly, you're having to document that in your agreements, which is, where is that line? You are providing a fully functioning system now based upon certain conditions. If it's again, as a consultant myself, I always laugh at my consultant speak, which is every design is considered to be 95% complete, when you're handing it out. Whereas, there are the things that you can't anticipate when you're going through a design process. You're trying to prognosticate as best you can, but we have no idea what Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, any of these companies are going to do in the future. So we have to inform, but also from a liability standpoint, at least stipulate, look, this is what we're able to provide right now. I'm not in control of those other companies and what they may push out in the future. So if this does occur, we do have a plan, and Mark was great about that. It's exactly, here are the contingency plans we have in place. And more importantly, here's how long our warranty lasts. From here on out, it's a service call. Who is going to be responsible at this point, whether it's handled by IT, if a change is made by IT, whether it's handled by the integrator, if it's handled by the programmer, and what it is causing, because we are working now so much more in a software-based world, the lines are far more blurred than they used to be. Again, in the old days, if a relay was a relay, and whatever was on the other side of the relay, that was somebody else's issue to deal with. It was either on or off. You can pull your control system out, that relay is still going to trigger. The same thing with even a serial interface. But now with IP-based, and especially now with IP-based protocols, it really is becoming a matter of, we are having to become, again, experts in fields not our own, and to educate and to basically be the canary in the coal mine, to say, hey, look, these are the things that may come down. We've experienced it already in small instances, and it's only going to continue. Obviously, there's There's a lot in the news that's come over the weekend. I mean, there was a security issue that happened on the microprocessor level that's potentially affected every single device on the planet, or at least most of them. Not something that us as control system programmers, really woke up one day and said, "Hey, I need to put this stipulation in my contract." So there has to be, and again, it's like that you've been doing with technology managers. Our job is to lay out where these issues might be occurring, and we are unfortunately the ones who tend to, like I said, be the canary in the coal mine on this one. We're typically the first ones to find out when the breakdown occurs.
So, Michael, I know that you're nodding your head and kind of resonating with this, and I wanted to kind of touch on something that Mark said earlier about the responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to manage all of this? And from a manufacturer's standpoint, is that always the case that you would figure the technology managers or the clients would be the ones managing firmware, or would you typically figure that it was another person in the food chain?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. It's a hard question because on some organizations, they take responsibility, they take ownership quickly, and integrators should have that detailed in their contract and their service agreements of what happens when, because some of these scenarios that Rich and Mark has painted happens, and when that happens, of course, and it happens every day, and when that happens, who pays for that? Who pays for the truck to roll out and to do these? And so it is. I think it's an underappreciated area, and it doesn't get the attention it deserves until something happens. And then once something happens, now it's almost too late. Obviously, you need to get the system going, and everybody, manufacturer, the integrator, the consultant, everybody comes together and does the best they can to do it. But there's so many unintended consequences, and that's why I appreciate what Mark was going through a lot. And even what Rich just talked about on the chips, this could be a board level, it could be a subcomponent level, it could be just a protocol. There are many versions of all kinds of protocols. So it's like you pick any protocol you want, like IGMP, pick that one There are, you know how many versions of IGMP there are? And so depending on what switches you have and what versions of firmware they have and they're running, so a simple change. I saw one, I'll give you an example. I won't name names of manufacturer, but I saw one where there was a firmware update. And in the firmware update, which took place, everything looked great. Everything seemed okay. And communication-wise, everything was going well. But all of a sudden, on the far end, lost video. The far end still had audio, still had control. You can still do everything. But the actual video image was gone. This was after a firmware update. And so, again, this brings into mind, hopefully you have some either backup plans or ability to roll back, which sounds normal, but you have to make sure, because not all devices are like if a device changes operating system, and that's part of the firmware update. Some firmware updates are very simple. I'm throwing some new libraries. I've changed a few things. But if part of the update you're doing is a new version of an OS, like what Rich was talking about, a change from a 32-bit kernel to a 64-bit, now that is you might not be able to roll that back. And so anyway, some of those you have to keep in mind. But in the example I gave where you lost video, the ultimate cause of that was part of the firmware update was changing the amount of data in the MTU frames, so the frame size data. Now that's, from an engineering point of view, there was something that was solved in changing that. However, the whole mechanism, your chain, from the input all the way through the infrastructure to the output, some locations had video. Some locations, some IDFs did not have video. They had audio, but they didn't have video. And the reason they didn't have video was there were, between the IDFs, there were fiber media adapters that some of them could not do the larger MTU frame sizes, or what a lot of people call jumbo frames. Like, it couldn't do those, but there were some parts of the network that didn't have those media adapters that could do it. So not only was it a different OS, a different firmware, a different chipset, like is brought up, but even within the switches, the little SFP, the little media fiber connections, even those have different capabilities. And so it's a lot different world. I wish we could go back to what Rich was talking about, where we had one firmware and we had our RGB HV cables and it was a little simpler than the TCP IP world.
So Mark, I'll invite you to kind of jump in here, and I know that a lot of this probably resonates well with you. When I guess the answer to the idea of who's responsible, is that something that's clear, or is that something that really needs to be debated?
Yeah, that's a good point. I was talking around, and Michael mentioned some of the ownership that happens. I mean, ultimately, the end user has this accountability, right? And yet this is actually, I believe, a value proposition for the integrator role and the support role that they play that really can be fleshed out more. Now, there is the challenge of reaching into the network, right? That you have to be able to get into their network now because of the segregations. You're really not going to be able to do a lot remotely in terms of upgrades if they have that nailed down the way it most likely would be. I also liked, and I'm going to go into this a little bit more, I like Michael's examples. I think examples are great to kind of illustrate some of the challenges. And mine recently, I was with a client, we were walking through some spaces with some Surface Hubs, and the technical person who was walking through noticed they were all not working. They had received overnight an update automatically. And I think you were talking about this even in the beginning of the show, is that in some cases, so we're moving to, it seemed like because of the complexities that were involved, or the arbitrary nature or control mechanisms that we have companies that, like Microsoft, wanting to be the management of the push, right? And so to get ahead of that and to be able to restrict those upgrades and to put them only into one system is a great concept. But then is it really possible to deploy that way, particularly if you're a smaller organization, you don't have a lot of staff, and you need to depend upon either the manufacturer or the software manufacturer to keep those updates going. I think in response to that, I guess the idea is of keeping it simple starts with standards, right? What I learned in the process, I mentioned one version of code at one company that did all the various permutations, right? So you'd think, wow, how am I going to be able to create all the various models of how that code could be deployed? Well, the reality is, if you have multiple rooms with the same consistency and then a problem happens, you're in a much better position to be able to identify where that change occurs. So a lot of our customers are implementing a custom code for every room. And wait a minute, the process here really starts to fall apart the more variables you put in, right? It doesn't solve it. We still have issues with drivers and other things, and we're seeing this world come around us that's not as much controller-oriented, it's more like USB and a lot of USB drivers. Assuming that's going to simplify, but as Michael mentioned, it just means the architecture around it's going to change. You still have to control it. But I think that process of creating consistency across as many rooms as you can is key, as well as a test plan, right? So what is that test plan that you're going to use? I think a lot of customers focus on the UI. They think of control as the moment that, what color is the button and where do I push it? They don't understand the whole architecture is really the bigger part of the dartboard, and that UI is just a small section of it. But they get the visualization. They are the best experience for their company, but they forget about the entire architecture that can make some of that stuff a little bit more simple, a little bit more consistent. So having a really good test plan and really good documentation of the changes that are occurring from version to version, I think are key. And I appreciate Michael nodding in the background as I said that.
Well, I think that we really opened up a can of worms that I think that we educated the audience very well with. And unfortunately, we're out of time for this today, but it sounds like a conversation that needs to be had. And we encourage people to be having within the industry and likely be covered again on one of our future shows. So with that, I'm going to thank my audience. First off, Rich Fregosa, thanks for being with us today, Rich. How can people get in touch with you?
You can obviously find me the fastest way. You can find me on Twitter at rfregosa. You can find me at fregosadesign.com. You can type my name into the Googles or any other search engine you like, and typically things about me pop up. And obviously you can see us here on State of Control and also Resi Week, and pretty much scattered about AVNation.
Wonderful. Michael Brathwaite, thanks for being with us today. How can people get in touch with you? And I hope you enjoyed your time on the show.
I did. Thank you. I look forward to coming back again. And on Twitter, I'm Dr. Decibel.
Nice. I like that one.
So I've had that since Twitter came out. So that's the best way to probably find me on LinkedIn, Google, so forth.
Wonderful. And last but not least, Mark Peterson, really thanks for being here today. How can people get in touch with you, learn more about Shen Milson Milwaukee, and hopefully you'll be back with us in the future again as well?
Thank you. I think they would probably do a lookup of Shen Milson Wilke. That's ShenMilsonWilke. And that will get you to the website. It's actually a really good website that includes not just be a whole variety of professionals. And that's probably the best way to reach me. I am on Twitter as a collab guru of some kind, but probably the website's the best one.
Wonderful. Thank you. So my name is Steve Greenblatt. I've been your host. You can reach me on most social media channels simply at Steve Greenblatt. My company is Control Concepts, and we're at controlconcepts.net. I'd like to welcome you to visit the AVNation website to check out some of the other shows on the site. As Rich mentioned, Resi Week, the ITAV show, I think is a great one for this audience. Show that's called Connected, and as well as the flagship of AV Week. And while you're there, please visit our underwriters. They help us to make things happen here at AVNation. So check them out, show them some love, and also do me a favor, leave us a comment, leave us a rating. We'd love to hear from you. And also we'd like to hear some more about what you want to hear from us in the future. So with that, that'll do it today for State of Control. Thanks for being with us.